The winter of 1942 carried with it the smoke of Pearl Harbor and the grim uncertainty of a world at war. Across the Atlantic, German officers scoffed at America's entry into the conflict. To them, the United States was no warrior nation. It was a nation of mechanics, a people of grease-stained hands and factory whistles, men and women who knew how to fix tractors, not topple empires. In Tokyo, Japanese leaders sneered that America might build cars and refrigerators, but lacked the spirit to sustain a global war. But within months, the United States began to prove them wrong. Detroit's auto factories, once humming with the rhythm of consumer production, thundered with new life as they forged tanks, aircraft, and engines of war. In California, the vast assembly halls of Douglas and Lockheed stretched wider with each passing week, their skylines dominated by the silhouettes of bombers taking shape. Norfolk shipyards hammered steel plates day and night, launching new vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. The numbers alone told a story that stunned observers. In 1942, a single American plant produced more aircraft than the entire Japanese empire possessed in its arsenal. Ford's Willow Run, carved from Michigan farmland, became the most ambitious assembly line in history. At its peak, it produced 1B, 24 Liberator every hour, day after day, an achievement so vast that even hardened generals struggled to comprehend it. Inside those factories, the workers themselves felt the weight of history. A riveter in Seattle recalled the roar of engines as newly finished bombers rolled out a hangar, saying it was as though our work itself was marching to war. In shipyards, welders spoke of the ground trembling under their boots as Liberty ships slid into the water, each one a floating artery of supplies destined for the front. The Axis mockery of America's mechanical character became the very fuel of its strength. While German pilots still boasted of their skill in the skies, and Japanese sailors of their devotion to the emperor, American engineers quietly redesigned engines, improved armor plating, and perfected production lines. These mechanics were not on the front lines, but their fingerprints covered every bolt and beam of the weapons that would be. The contrast could not have been sharper. In 1942, Germany was forced to ration steel, with production bottlenecks crippling its armaments program. Japan, already short on raw materials, gambled on daring offensives to secure oil and resources. Meanwhile, America's factories roared to life, powered by an industrial base untouched by bombing and fed by abundant natural resources. This chapter of the story is not about soldiers storming beaches or pilots dueling above the clouds, but about the men and women who wielded tools instead of rifles. Mechanics, welders, draftsmen, and machinists became warriors of a different kind. Their battlefield was the assembly line, their weapons the tanks, planes, and ships that poured from American factories. Axis leaders had thought America's industrial base a weakness, a sign of softness, a reliance on machines. Instead, it became the invisible army that would decide the war. One German officer later admitted with bitterness that America's factories were worth more divisions than any general could command. By the end of 1942, the tide had not yet turned. The Allies still bled in North Africa. The skies over Europe were dangerous, and the Pacific was a cauldron of uncertainty. But something had shifted. A sleeping giant had awoken, and had spoken the language of engine, steel, and fire. The nation of mechanics was rising, and soon the world would feel the weight of its awakening. Only a decade before the thunder of war reached American shores, the nation had been on its knees. The Great Depression had left factories silent, bread lines stretching for blocks, and confidence in the American dream shattered. In 1939, the United States military ranked 17th in the world, smaller even than Portugal's. Its navy had strength, but its air force was a fledgling, and its army was a skeleton of what a modern war demanded. For the dictators in Berlin and Tokyo, the United States was not a rival, but a sleeping giant too slow, too fractured, and too unprepared to be a threat. Yet within months, the picture began to change. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, watching the storm clouds over Europe, issued a challenge that seemed impossible: the production of 50,000 airplanes per year. At the time, America had built fewer than 3,000 in 12 months. To German observers, it sounded like political bravado. But Roosevelt's words would set in motion the largest industrial mobilization in human history. Civilian industries became the backbone of the new arsenal. The Ford Motor Company, once known for its Model T, retooled its lines to build bombers. General Motors produced tanks and engines instead of Buicks. Typewriter manufacturers turned out rifles. Refrigerator plants forged machine gun parts. Even toy companies and sewing machine firms found themselves under military contracts. Factories that had struggled to survive the Depression now ran 24 hours a day, their assembly lines repurposed for destruction abroad. The transformation reached far beyond machinery. The workforce itself changed. Men who might have worn overalls in machine shops now drafted blueprints for submarines. Women left farms and small towns to take jobs in Seattle's aircraft plants or Cleveland's tank factories. Letters and diaries captured their astonishment at the scale of the mobilization. One woman who left Kansas farmland for Douglas aircraft recalled the endless roar of rivet guns, as if the very air had turned to steel. Another worker in Detroit wrote of the pride he felt when the first tank he had helped assemble rolled past, bound for North Africa. This industrial revolution was not merely about machines, but about speed. The United States learned to mass-produce war. The B-24 Liberator, a complex heavy bomber, had once required months of careful assembly. At Willow Run in Michigan, a factory designed by Ford engineers reduced that process to hours. By late 1942, one bomber rolled off its line every 60 minutes. Shipyards across the country built Liberty ships so quickly that one was famously launched just 4 days after its keel had been laid. The Axis powers, steeped in traditional notions of martial strength, miscalculated. They assumed that America's devotion to production betrayed weakness, that a people who built cars and refrigerators lacked the will to fight. But Washington's gamble was that modern war would not be won by warriors alone, but by welders, mechanics, and engineers. By 1942, the gamble was paying off. American tanks began to roll into Tunisia. Warplanes filled the skies over Europe. Supply convoys stretched across the Atlantic, laden with food, fuel, and weapons for embattled Britain and the Soviet Union. Inside the Reich, German intelligence officers began to take notice. Reports described astonishing increases in American production capacity. One Luftwaffe officer admitted privately that if the United States could sustain such output, Germany's war would become unwinnable. Japan, too, began to feel the strain. The planes it had lost at Midway could not be replaced at anything near the pace of America's production lines. The transformation of the United States from depression to arsenal was more than economic. It was cultural. In towns and cities across the nation, citizens came to see their factory work as combat by another name. Newspapers called them the soldiers of production. The factories became battlefields. The shift whistled their bugle call. By late 1942, America had not yet overwhelmed the Axis. Its armies were still learning to fight, its navy still bleeding in the Pacific. But the arsenal was awake, and the sheer volume of steel, fire, and fuel produced had begun to tilt the balance of the war. What had been dismissed as a nation of mechanics was fast becoming the arsenal of democracy. By 1943, the thunder of American industry had found its voice not only in the deafening roar of assembly lines, but in the battlefield presence of machines they produced. What had begun as a gamble on mass production now manifested as steel, fire, and power on every front of the war. Detroit, once the heart of the automobile, had become the arsenal of democracy. Its factories, now humming with military contracts, produced Sherman tanks in such numbers that the armored divisions of the U.S. Army seemed limitless. The Sherman was not the most sophisticated tank of the war. German Panthers and Tigers often outgunned and outarmored it. Yet what the Sherman lacked in raw superiority, it made up for in reliability, speed of production, and adaptability. For every Tiger that rolled off German lines, the United States produced dozens of Shermans. Crews spoke of the comfort in knowing replacements were always on the horizon. One tanker later recalled that, "We lost friends, we lost machines, but the Shermans never stopped coming." This overwhelming presence shifted the balance of armored warfare, giving Allied commanders flexibility that the Wehrmacht could not match. Above the clouds, America's aircraft plants reshaped the skies. The P-51 Mustang, sleek and deadly, gave the Allies long-range reach into the heart of Germany. The B-17 Flying Fortress and its partner, the B-24 Liberator, carried destruction to factories, rail yards, and fuel depots with relentless precision. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, the Liberator was mass-produced on an unprecedented scale. The numbers defied comprehension. A bomber once requiring months to assemble now rolled off the line every hour. To the men who flew them, these aircraft became lifelines, machines that carried them deep into danger but also carried the hope of returning home. Eyewitnesses remembered the atmosphere of the factories with awe. Riveters worked shoulder to shoulder, sparks flying across vast hangars, their drills and hammers creating a constant metallic symphony. It was as if the ground itself was alive, one worker recalled, beating in time with the pulse of war. Even in the darkest hours of the conflict, the sound of those factories was reassurance. The arsenal was awake, and its roar was unstoppable. On the seas, America's mechanics achieved feats no less extraordinary. The Liberty ship, unglamorous but vital, became the backbone of Allied logistics. Built in shipyards along both coasts, these cargo vessels were designed to be simple, sturdy, and above all, fast-produced. The records astonished even their builders. In 1942, a Liberty ship was completed in 4 days and 15 hours, faster than a German U-boat could sink it. With thousands launched during the war, the Atlantic supply line became a river of steel and cargo, outpacing the depredations of the U-boat wolf packs. Where German admirals had once hoped to starve Britain into submission, they now face a logistical machine that produced ships faster than they could be destroyed. The Axis, steeped in precision engineering, mocked these machines. German officers dismissed the Sherman as a rolling coffin and sneered at the Liberty ship's crude design. Yet their contempt turned to frustration as they realized the sheer scale of American production was unanswerable. For every tank knocked out, another took its place. For every bomber downed, 2 more filled the skies. For every ship sunk, another sailed with supplies and men. A German officer later admitted, it seemed as though their factories had no end. The genius of American war production was not perfection, but sufficiency. The machines were not always elegant, but they were reliable, adaptable, and, above all, available in staggering numbers. The Sherman could be fitted with new guns and armor. The B-24 was modified into reconnaissance and transport versions. The Liberty ship carried not just cargo, but troops, fuel, and even aircraft. This adaptability magnified the impact of American industry, allowing the Allies to adjust quickly to the shifting demands of global war. By 1944, the results were undeniable. On the battlefields of Europe, fleets of Shermans rolled eastward behind the D-Day landings. In the skies over Germany, B-17s and B-24s darkened the horizon. Across the oceans, convoys of Liberty ships carried the weight of the war. The very machines the Axis had mocked were now instruments of their undoing. America's mechanics had built more than weapons. They had built a tide of steel that the Axis could not resist. And with every tank that rolled off the line, every bomber that took flight, and every ship that set sail, the outcome of the war tilted further toward Allied victory. Beneath the deafening roar of engines and the relentless thunder of factory floors, the true force behind America's industrial miracle was not steel or machinery. It was people. By 1943, millions of Americans had traded plows, offices, and classrooms for welding torches, rivet guns, and drafting tables. The assembly lines were not merely mechanical. They were human, stretched across cities and towns, powered by sweat, discipline, and sacrifice. For the first time in American history, women entered the workforce in staggering numbers. They became the now iconic Rosie the Riveters, their hair tucked beneath scarves, their hands calloused from drills and welding rods. In California, women assembled aircraft frames for B-17 Flying Fortresses. In Detroit, they welded steel plates to Sherman tanks. One worker later recalled writing her brother at the front, "I cannot carry a rifle beside you, but I built the wings that carried your bomber." The pride was real, even as exhaustion from double shifts left them collapsing into bed at night. African-American workers, long excluded from better-paying industrial jobs, pressed for inclusion in the war effort under pressure from civil rights activists and leaders like Philip Randolph. The government passed Executive Order 8802 in 1941, banning racial discrimination in defense industries. Progress was uneven and segregation persisted, but the war forced cracks in the old order. Black welders, machinists, and engineers proved indispensable. In the shipyards of Mobile and the plants of Cleveland, they labored alongside white workers, often under tense conditions, yet united by quotas and deadlines that could not wait. Immigrants and rural families, too, entered the industrial army. Farmer sons left behind fields to draft blueprints. Grandmothers who had never set foot in a factory before worked stamping machines or stitched uniforms in textile mills. In many towns, entire communities seemed absorbed by a single purpose: producing for war. A factory whistle at dawn was not just the start of a shift. It was a call to battle on the home front. The demands were relentless. The War Production Board set quotas that climbed month after month. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of aircraft, and millions of rifles. Families at home faced rationing, sugar, rubber, gasoline, to ensure that resources flowed to the factories and onward to the front. Housewives wrote in letters of saving bacon fat for explosives or patching old clothes so that textiles could go to uniforms. Nothing was wasted. Every drop of fuel, every pound of steel carried the weight of lives on a line overseas. Atmosphere inside the factories was both exhausting and electric. Rivet guns cracked like gunfire. Sparks showered the floor, and the air grew hot with the smell of oil and molten metal. Breaks were brief. Shifts often stretched to 16 hours, and the danger was real. Injuries from machinery were common, yet the sense of purpose was overwhelming. Workers spoke of reading headlines about battles in North Africa or the Pacific, then returning to their machines with renewed determination. One man in a Detroit plant wrote, "Every bolt I tighten, I imagine it fastening down a Nazi's coffin." The transformation went beyond production. For millions, the war blurred the line between soldier and civilian. Families sacrificed together. Children collected scrap metal and rubber in neighborhood drives. Churches and schools volunteered space for sewing uniforms or rolling bandages. On the assembly line, Americans of every background found themselves enlisted into the nation's arsenal, their tools as vital as rifles on the front lines. What emerged was not simply an economy mobilized for war, but a society reshaped by war. Women learned skills and gained independence they had never been offered before. African-American workers pushed against barriers that would fuel the civil rights movement to come. Immigrants and rural laborers discovered new communities in industrial cities. The home front became a theater of war in its own right, where victory was measured not in captured territory, but in quotas met, ships launched, and planes delivered. As the months passed, the connection between the factory floor and the battlefield grew undeniable. A bomber leaving Willow Run carried with it the fingerprints of thousands of men and women. A Sherman tank rolling into Europe bore the sweat of welders in Detroit. In every Liberty ship that left the slipways, the human assembly line left its mark. The Axis had mocked America as a nation of mechanics. Yet those mechanics, aided by welders, riveters, and laborers from every walk of life, had forged the weapons of victory. Each rivet driven, each bolt tightened, was a silent vow that the sacrifices on the home front would echo on distant battlefields. By 1943, the balance of the war began to tilt in a way the Axis could not ignore. What they had once dismissed as a nation of factory hands and grease-stained mechanics had revealed itself as something far more dangerous, a nation whose workshops could outbuild empires. From the burning sands of North Africa to the storm-lashed seas of the Pacific, American machines, and the men who built them, pressed the Axis on every front. In Tunisia, German panzer crews peered across dunes to find lines of Sherman tanks advancing in near-endless columns. For every panzer they managed to knock out, two more Sherman seemed to roll forward, their engines growling, their silhouettes filling the horizon. A German officer later admitted with frustration that American tanks seemed to arrive as though from an assembly line with no end. The truth was not far from it. Detroit's factories were turning farmland and steel into armored divisions at a pace Germany could never match. In the skies over Europe, the same grim pattern repeated. Formations of B, 17 flying fortresses, sometimes numbering hundreds, stretched across the clouds in waves that darkened the sun. Contrails scarred the blue expanse, while Luftwaffe pilots found themselves hurling into swarms that seemed to multiply faster than they could be destroyed. After battles above Bremen and Kiel, German intelligence reports carried a tone of despair. For every fortress down, dozens more appeared within days. Crews spoke of the exhaustion of scrambling again and again, only to find their enemies reinforced beyond reason. Across the Pacific, Japanese naval officers witnessed a nightmare of their own. Carrier decks that had been emptied at Coral Sea and Midway were now overflowing once more with fresh squadrons of fighters and dive bombers. For every ship the Imperial Navy sent to the bottom, 3 new vessels seemed to appear, steaming across the ocean escorted by convoys of Liberty ships. Built in American shipyards, these transports and carriers replaced losses at a pace Japanese admirals could scarcely believe. Admiral Yamamoto, already haunted by a prediction that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, now faced the reality of that warning. The contrast between the Axis and America grew sharper with each month. Germany, starved of fuel and stretched by campaigns on the Eastern Front, could not replace lost aircraft or tanks fast enough. Oil plants bombed in Romania crippled reserves, forcing Luftwaffe training flights to be cut short and panzer divisions to ration fuel. Japan, dependent on imports for steel and raw materials, faced blockades that strangled its capacity to replenish warships and aircraft. Mechanics and engineers were in short supply, yet in America, they seemed limitless. Eyewitnesses on the Axis side began to voice what their leaders already feared. German infantrymen in Italy wrote home about the iron tide of American convoys bringing supplies across the Mediterranean. Japanese pilots, tasked with striking U.S. fleets, returned in disbelief, describing convoy after convoy, each ringed by destroyers bristling with anti-aircraft guns. What had once been sneers, America as a nation mechanics, now echoed as bitter recognition. On the ground, in the air, and across the seas, America's industrial might was no longer theory. It was steel and fire, moving relentlessly forward. Each tank that rolled off an assembly line, each bomber lifted from a runway, each ship launched from a slipway represented not just hardware, but the transformation of a people who had turned wrenches into weapons. The Axis, stretched thin, confronted a grim truth. Their resources dwindled even as America's seemed inexhaustible. The War of Warriors was becoming a war of production, and in that struggle, America's mechanics wielded the decisive advantage. By 1944, the war had reached a decisive stage. What had once been a question of survival now became a question of momentum. America's mechanics, men and women who labored not on battlefields but in the heart of factories and shipyards, had given the Allies the means to turn the tide. Their handiwork was nowhere more visible than on the shores of Normandy in June of that year. On D-Day, more than 5,000 vessels assembled in the English Channel, the largest armada in human history. Liberty ships, tank landing craft, and massive troop transport stretched from horizon to horizon. Their hulls, welded in American yards at a pace the Axis could not comprehend, carried not just soldiers but the machinery of liberation, tanks, trucks, bulldozers, and endless crates of ammunition. Above them, swarms of Allied aircraft, see 47 transports, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, and flying fortresses, secured the skies, a dominance only possible because U.S. factories had filled the airfields of Britain with metal and firepower. German defenders braced behind concrete bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, but what they faced was more than an army. It was a culmination of industrial strength unleashed. One German officer later admitted that the sight of the invasion fleet left him staring at the industrial weight of an entire continent. In the Pacific, the same transformation played out across vast ocean distances. The island-hopping campaigns that carried U.S. Marines and sailors ever closer to Japan required more than courage. They demanded miracles of logistics. Floating dry docks were towed across seas to repair warships on the spot. Prefabricated airfields were erected on captured atolls in a matter of weeks, allowing bombers to leapfrog across the Pacific. Supply lines, stretching thousands of miles from California to the front, carried a ceaseless flow of food, fuel, and ammunition. GIs on the front lines were often astonished at the consistency of support. Letters home marveled that fresh equipment seemed to appear as fast as it was needed. One soldier recalled, "It felt like America itself was marching with us." Every crate stamped with a factory's mark was proof that we were not forgotten. To men enduring the mud of Normandy or the jungles of the Philippines, those crates of supplies symbolized the hands of millions of unseen workers who fought with rivet guns, welding torches, and blueprints. For Axis leaders, the realization came slowly but with grim certainty. German intelligence reports acknowledged that American losses in tanks, planes, and ships mattered little when replacements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Japanese admirals, staring at convoys protected by entire screens of destroyers, wrote bitterly that for every ship we sink, 3 more appear. The very mockery that had once defined American industry, that it was a nation of mechanics, not warriors, had turned to dread. Mechanics, it seemed, could outfight even the most disciplined soldiers when measured in steel and fire. The turning tide was not simply about numbers. It was about tempo. The Allies could launch offensives when they chose, secure in the knowledge that the supply lines behind them would hold. Germany and Japan, in contrast, fought with dwindling reserves, each battle consuming irreplaceable resources. By the end of 1944, the evidence was unmistakable. In Europe, the Allies had broken through at Normandy, advancing into France and pushing toward the Rhine. In the Pacific, American carriers dominated the seas, while superfortresses rose from newly built airfields in the Marianas to strike the Japanese home islands. Every advance traced back to mechanics who had made it possible, workers who proved that in the modern age of total war, victory depended as much on production lines as on front lines. The tide had turned. America's mechanics had become the engine of victory, and the Axis now found itself fighting not just armies, but an inexhaustible arsenal that seemed to march forward with every soldier. By 1945, the war that had begun with doubts about America's strength ended with proof that the nation's true weapon was its industry. In just 4 years, U.S. factories produced more than 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and nearly 3,000 Liberty ships. The number seemed almost impossible, dwarfing Axis production and flooding every front with the machines of war. It was not simply the soldiers who carried the victory, but the men and women behind assembly lines, who turned ridicule into reality and mechanics into warriors of a different kind. In Detroit, assembly lines that had once built sedans now produced Sherman tanks, each rolling forward as a piece of America's industrial might. In California, aircraft plants built squadrons of bombers faster than enemy pilots could shoot them down. Along the coast, shipyards hammered steel day and night, launching Liberty ships at a pace that astonished both allies and enemies. These were the engines of victory, forged not by generals, but by welders, riveters, and machinists. The cost of this miracle was not measured only in steel and oil. Factory shifts stretched to 16 hours, accidents claimed lives, and families endured long separations. Wartime rationing meant sacrifices at every dinner table, from meat to gasoline. Yet pride infused the sacrifice. One factory worker later recalled, "We may not have been in the trenches, but every bolt we tightened was a bullet fired at the enemy." For millions of Americans, their contribution bound them directly to the battlefields across oceans. On the other side of the war, the Axis slowly came to terms with what they had underestimated. German officers admitted in post-war interrogations that they had dismissed American industry as undisciplined and clumsy. Instead, they faced an avalanche of production that no strategy could withstand. Japanese leaders reflected bitterly that industrial power, not battlefield tactics, had sealed their defeat. In their words, it was not just soldiers, but the factories that won the war. The legacy of America's wartime industry endured long after the last bombs fell. Vast factories that once roared with labor fell silent. Their machines shut down, but their memory preserved. Across desert airfields in Arizona and New Mexico, thousands of bombers were lined up wingtip to wingtip, glinting under the sun as relics of an industrial miracle. Rows of tanks and ships, no longer needed, were mothballed or scrapped, symbols of a nation that had built victory on a scale the world had never seen. For veterans, the phrase nation mechanics carried a new meaning. What began as Axis contempt became a badge of honor, proof that welders and engineers could wield tools with the power of rifles. The war had shown that in the age of machines, victory required more than courage on the battlefield. It demanded an arsenal capable of sustaining campaigns across continents and oceans, an industrial heart that beat as fiercely as any army. The memory of this transformation became part of America's national story. It stood as evidence that democracy, once challenged by tyranny, had not only survived but triumphed through unity and labor. Factories, farms, and shipyards had become battlefields of their own, and the workers who manned them stood as silent soldiers of victory. As the documentary closes, the image lingers: vast, empty factories, their machines quiet, but their walls still echoing with the hammering of wartime labor. Across desert plains, fleets of B-17s and B-24s shimmer in heat, parked in endless rows, monuments of production on an unimaginable scale. The nation of mechanics, once mocked, now revered, had built not just machines but triumph itself.